Why don't we start with a quick prayer in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Loving and faithful God, as we gather, as so many gather this morning in this beautiful place, let us be joyful that so many desire to hear your word, different facets of your word, different ways in which we can express our faith in our world today. We ask you to bless this group that gathers this morning, bless those who go without, and we bring all of our prayers to you through Christ our Lord. Amen. St. Ignatius of Loyola, pray for us. And before we get started, if anyone is interested, and there's some flyers over on the table where the waters are over there, and please help yourself to waters as well. But at the end of October, the Busy Persons Retreat will be coming up, and that's a welcome opportunity for all of us. Please not only take one for yourselves, but if you think someone might be interested, spread the word. You can also find out about it on our website. There's also information on our website about a meeting that came up rather late, but it's on Thursday of this week in Washington, D.C. All of the Jesuit provincials, including our own of the United States, are meeting as a group with the Director of Homeland Security to talk about refugees and migrants at the border and their concerns about their dignity and safety. And what they asked us to do at the last minute was to gather as all of the Jesuit institutions of each area. So the Jesuit institutions of Arizona, the Keno Border Initiative, Creighton Medical School at St. Joseph's Hospital, Brophy, St. Francis Xavier Parish, St. Francis Xavier School will all come together, and we'll be having a meeting with some of our congressional leaders here in Arizona. And then we're going to be talking about that same issue. You can find out details about that as in the afternoon, and then we're actually all going to come back here for a light supper to follow it and talk about the issues of concern. And it really gets to the issue that we come here today to talk about. I think a lot of us are very familiar with the idea that Jesuits advocate for social justice. And it's a kind of a question, okay, well, some people say, what does that really mean? And then why do we do it? And if you go up and down Central Avenue as often as I do, you see on the side of our church it says St. Francis Xavier Church, a Jesuit parish. And the thing is, what makes us write a Jesuit parish? And why do we call it a Jesuit parish? And it goes beyond having simply members of the Society of Jesus or Jesuits staffing a parish, but it goes to the very core of who we are as Jesuits and what we desire Jesuit parishes to be. We're going to see a very short little video clip right now. And this short little video clip, no relation to me, but you're going to be introduced to a man named Father Vincent O'Keefe. He is a Jesuit of the old New York province. He's now deceased, so pray for his soul. But he was a dear and good friend of Father Arrupe, and he was supposed to be in line to be Father General, but something didn't quite work out. That's an interesting story that I can tell you on a different day. But he gives us a good introduction to the topic that we're talking about, and it kind of ties in the history of the society and more contemporary ways in which we express our desire for social justice.
Many people ask me about the person and the personality of Pedro Arrupe, because I think it's an obvious question. He's been referred to so often as the second Ignatius. What I think Pedro Arrupe did was to get into the mind and heart and spirit of Ignatius. He was a fellow Basque, and that helped a lot. Ignatius had a great beginning because in his time there was a fundamental option that was expressed this way: it's God or the world. And that meant like fleeing from the world, separating from the world. The world was considered something to be avoided, to be shunned. But Ignatius said, no, that equation doesn't go. It's God in the world. And that's what it means, because we're going to find God in people, in our brothers and sisters, and in the big events. So it's not separating from the world, it's going to the world, because we're going to find God in the world. And we find him there not because we put him there, but because he is there. That's what we're dealing with. So I think the basic thing about Pedro Arrupe then was that he shared that intuition really of Ignatius, that you go to the world. You don't separate off from it. You go to it because that's where you find people. When we talk about Arrupe as being second Ignatian, we mean that he was 100% Ignatian. And that's what made him so attractive. It wasn't that he just convinced us. What he said and what he did was infectious. You wanted to do it. You wanted to be in that company. You wanted to be associated with the group doing those same things. And that's what made all the difference, that there was this quality about him. So when Arrupe became general, remember he was elected May 22 of 1965. It was a great day. So he developed what he liked to call, and we took it up, it's an Ignatian thing, our way of proceeding. That way it wasn't the constitutions and all that. No, this is our way of doing it. And people should be able to expect this of us, expect this of a Jesuit, that if in this situation, this is the way a Jesuit would act. This is the way a son of Ignatius would do it. And that's what he wanted. So the whole thing was our way of proceeding, and develop that, and that would be his policy. So these were the things that were part of his personality, that attracted people. As I say, he made it not just convincing, but infectious. Arrupe always had a dream that he wanted to unite the best talents we had in our society, best spiritual and apostolic talents, so that we would have one mission that would involve everybody. And he was convinced, Arrupe, that we, the Jesuit order, we were exercising our apostolate in a world that was really burdened by unbelief and by injustice. He had been led to that by his travels and his great experience. He said, those are the two factors that should influence our whole apostolate. And he wanted to have some mission for the whole society. Well, when GC 32 voted in, the mission of every Jesuit and of all Jesuits is the service of faith and the promotion of justice in the name of the gospel. When that was voted in, he was delirious. He was so happy, because this wasn't Arrupe. This was the Society of Jesus. We moved through, especially through GC 32, into this great mission then, that serving the faith and promoting justice. And promoting justice became a big thing in the eyes of many. So Arrupe had to really fight the struggle through his talks and writings to say, no, it's not service of faith or promotion of justice, it's the integration of the two. They go hand in hand, and they have to go that way. And what we mean by this promotion of justice, we have to explain very carefully. The best statement, I think, you can go through so much, is what we developed. We said what we mean by the promotion of justice, it's promoting in society that justice of the gospel, which is the embodiment of God's love and saving mercy. Don't think of justice as, a quid pro quo or distributive justice. No, justice really is filled with God's with love. That's the driving force there. So think of it as that justice, which is the embodiment of God's love and saving mercy. That's what we're talking about. Well, this gave a whole new elan to the society, and a great surge of people felt that, we really, our Jesuit things were still so relevant, and that this was the way to go, and we had influence in the society. Arrupe had a great talent for bringing back to life not only Jesuit values and priorities, but expressions. Like he brought the Majas back to life. And that's the whole point, for that greater glory, everything for the more in this. And Arrupe showed that we could still today show how this works out in action.
That film clip that we just saw again really does tell us something about the Society of Jesus and why we have this focus on what we commonly today call social justice. It almost seems like an academic term, but I read you something that's an interesting description of it. I'm sure you're all familiar with the Christmas Carol and Scrooge and Jacob Marley. And if you listen to the words that the two of them forged, when Scrooge saw Jacob Marley wearing the chains that he forged in life as a punishment for not making good use of his time, Scrooge protests, "But you were always a good man of business, Jacob." To which Marley meant business. "Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, benevolence were all my business. The dealings of my trade were but a drop of water in the comprehensive ocean of my business." I don't think we remember that from watching the movie too much. Today, more than ever, we need to hear that same message. The common welfare is our business, and that's what the society terms social justice. Taking care of those that are unable to speak for themselves or take care of themselves. And it's interesting, when I mentioned that Father O'Keefe, who you saw, was supposed to become the next Father General, and it's tied into an earlier period of history of the society. It's almost like history repeated itself. Because back in the 1800s, and it was specifically because of those two things he brought up, unbelief and a lack of justice in Europe. That's where the Society of Jesus was founded. That's where most of their work was done. Most of the royal houses of Europe welcomed the Jesuits in because they were part of the Counter-Reformation and they were trying to remain Catholic. And the only thing is that after they somewhat successfully, or after the Counter-Reformation ended and Catholic countries that chose to do so remained Catholic, you still had a whole bunch of Jesuits doing good work. So all of a sudden the Jesuits started talking about unbelief in those Catholic countries, in those Catholic kingdoms, and justice in those Catholic kingdoms. Most people appreciated that, except the kings in those Catholic kingdoms. And that's what led, ultimately, to the suppression of the Society of Jesus, which did happen for a period of time late at the end of the last century. And when that suppression happened, the kings were a little uncomfortable because they're the ones who held all the power. They're the ones who held all the money. They're the ones who were literally, in some cases, enslaving people. And the Jesuits were speaking out against that kind of injustice. And then when the society was finally brought back, the end of the suppression, the society became a little scared. The society was a little frightened about having the suppression happen again. They almost became a little bit too quiet on these issues of justice and unbelief. So they became like every other religious orders. And if you notice those pictures, I'm sorry I forgot to wear my black cape today, of the Jesuits in the 1960s, but they kind of became like every other religious order for a period of time until Father Arrupe came on the scene. And Father Arrupe said, and Vatican II called us to go back to the roots of why you were founded. And for Arrupe, that meant go back to unbelief and go back to injustice. And that's where everything was rooted in for him, as we just saw. The idea of being men and women for others came out of the words of Father Arrupe. Fighting for the needs of others came out of the words of Father Arrupe. And it really has defined this period from the society at the time of the post-Vatican II election of Arrupe till today. Where Father O'Keefe fits in is somewhere around 1980. Father Arrupe, who was quite a character, believe it or not, and quite a magnificent man if you get to read his biography, he was on the ground in Hiroshima when the atomic bomb fell, working with Jesuits there. And he helped save countless lives, did the best they could to save people who were hurt. Thank God he wasn't hurt in that. But he saw injustice firsthand, so he knew what he was talking about. He worked in Asia most of his Jesuit life until he was elected Father General. Now, he wanted to retire when he got too ill. And at the time, Pope John Paul II would not let him retire. And finally, he said, well, okay, I'm just going to continue. Now, Father O'Keefe was the likely successor to Arrupe. That's why if Father Arrupe retired, Father O'Keefe would have got elected. Now, John Paul II was a little suspicious, almost like the kings of Europe were centuries before, about the Jesuits. Who are you, and what are you doing, and what's all this social justice stuff? Sounds a little communistic to me. I'm not criticizing John Paul II, but that's the church he grew up in. That's what he understood. So he was a little suspicious of all this social justice stuff because, and to many people, I'm sure you know, people can say, well, the Jesuits are a little funny. And it's like, yeah, we're a little funny in a good way. But it has nothing to do with communism, because you can't have justice without faith, and you can't have faith without justice. They can coexist. And that's something that we very much tried to do. So when Pedro Arrupe actually later had a stroke and made him completely immobile, and still John Paul would not give him permission to retire. And then when, unfortunately, he did finally pass, John Paul didn't allow the normal procedures of the society to take place. He forced his own choice in to be the head of the Society of Jesus, which left Father O'Keefe out of the money. Not that he was going to get any money for that job, but that was the idea. Later, it did change. John Paul became a little more aware of what the society was truly all about, a little more understanding of what social justice is. But it is a flashpoint. A lot of people get concerned about that. If you watch TV today, people don't understand. They think it's some sort of communist plot to destroy America or some sort of thing. It's really just taking care of one another, taking care of one another. I have a little flyer because to do so, and I think we have them here. Susie, do you have? Oh, I have them. Never mind. Just recently, the Society published what we call the Universal Apostolic Preferences of the Society. If I could give you a bunch of those, if you could pass those out. Some of these to you, if you could pass one behind you. And these are the way in which the society today, this is 2019, the way we get to promote it. I'll give one more. And Father General in Rome, and therefore Father Santa Rosa in the West Coast province, has charged all of us as Jesuits and as Jesuit institutions to follow the universal apostolic preferences of the Society of Jesus. And these universal apostolic preferences are rooted in the works of Father Arrupe, are rooted in the ideal of social justice. So if you see them, and they, in a certain way, go hand in hand. The very first apostolic preference is promoting discernment in the spiritual exercises. Of course, the spiritual exercises of Ignatius are the root of everything that a Jesuit and that a Jesuit institution should do. How do we make decisions about what's most important? And to do that, we have to go to our faith. We have to delve into our faith to decide what is of God and what is not of God. What is God calling us to do? And that takes some time. And that means to be deliberate. And that takes prayer. And that's one of the very first apostolic preferences. Because if we're going to move into a new way of doing things, and not so much a new way of doing things, but a new set of priorities, then we need to pray about it and make sure that it's something that we should do. And you're going to be hearing a little bit more about that in the next year or so, because Father Santa Rosa, the West Coast Province Provincial, has asked every Jesuit institution, whether it's a school or a parish or a social ministry, to embark on a reinvigoration of the spiritual exercises for all of us. You're going to be hearing more about that. But then, of course, he talks about walking with the excluded. That hits us in a very personal way here in the state of Arizona. It's a hot-button political issue in the state of Arizona. And if it was brought up in the times of the kings and queens of Europe, we might be suppressed. Let's hope we're not. Thank God we have a Jesuit pope that probably won't do that. But walking with the excluded, those who are not welcome into our country, or treated inhumanely as they seek to gain entrance in our country. Now, put aside the political questions about legal and not legal and proper and not proper. The question is, how are we treating the people who are seeking to find a home in this country? How are we treating them? And how are we treating them even when they come into this country legally, if you want to say it that way? But we view them suspiciously sometimes as a society. And they're not necessarily treated well. They're separated from their children. They're given a hard time. They're told if they, and there's a meeting today right here in this room about if you think you might be on some sort of public assistance in the next few years, you can't become a citizen, you can't stay. And that's been a thing. And we have 2 lawyers coming this afternoon to advise our mainly Spanish-speaking population how to properly deal with those kinds of questions, because they're really trying to scare people into going home. That's not walking with the excluded, that's pushing them away. And as a Jesuit institution, we want to walk with those who have less. And we could expand that walking with the excluded, because we often talk about those who are on the economic margins, and these people certainly are, but there's an awful lot of other excluded people in our world. What about people who don't necessarily follow all the teachings of the church. We welcome them. We try to change their minds. We don't necessarily have to agree with them, but we treat them humanely as God asks us to do. Jesus sat down with sinners and Jesus sat down with prostitutes, so we can sit down with everyone that God sends our way. The other is caring for our common home. Caring for our common home was the foundation from Laudatio Si, one of the very first encyclicals that Pope Francis wrote. How do we take care of and contribute to the welfare of this world in which we all live? And of course, there's a justice side to that, because just because we happen to be a wealthier country, how are we treating people who are not in wealthy countries? How are we necessarily maybe taking their resources and using them for our benefit? And do we need to look at that? It doesn't make a conclusion, but it asks us to care for our common home and to recognize that it doesn't belong to any one of us. I had a class over at St. Francis Xavier School recently when we were talking about Father Kino, who evangelized the entire southern Arizona, Sonora desert area. And I said, we were looking at a map, and I said, you have to pretend that border between Mexico and Arizona didn't exist, because it didn't at the time. And he just went from place to place to place. It didn't matter where people were from, but that we should care for our common home. And then journeying with youth. That's the last thing that he's asking us to do as a society. So he's asking us to promote discernment, figure out how we should properly walk with the excluded, figure out how we should care for our common home, and figure out what the most effective way to journey with our youth is. All of this rooted in an idea that we should be about unbelief, which is so prevalent in our world today, and be about justice together. So that's my quick and probably very incomplete discussion about social justice, but I wanted to give you as quick a history and idea and where social justice stands for us as a society, as a parish, as a Jesuit institution today. I look forward to Thursday when people from Creighton and Brophy and St. Francis Xavier Parish and St. Francis Xavier Elementary School and the Kino Border Initiative down in Nogales will join together for the very first time as an Ignatian family of Arizona, we're calling ourselves, to fight for some of these justice issues. That's really what we should be all about. That's what makes us a Jesuit parish, or if we do it correctly, that's what makes us a Jesuit parish. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have. I just wanted to give you a short summary. I hope you found that video helpful, and I hope you found other aspects of that story helpful. Does anyone have any particular question they might be interested in asking? He originally was Basque, just like Ignatius. He was from the Basque country of Spain, but he spent most of his Jesuit life in Asia. Most of his, as I said, he was in Japan at the time the atomic bomb fell. But he has quite a remarkable life story long before he became general. You could have written about a book about him even before he got to that latter part of his life. And he was rather remarkable. Even when he was, not only did he have a stroke, but he had one of those strokes left him completely immobile, completely, 95%. And he said, I never felt myself more in the hands of God than when I was completely immobile, if you could imagine that. So you can see why he was so inspiring to this day. He's really the modern society. They call him the modern Ignatius, from the same part of the country of Spain, and did some of the same things. And he probably never imagined he would do any of them when he started his life. Hi.
What do you think of when you think about journeying with youth? Any particular programs?
Well, I agree with you. It becomes, when we ask that question, it's almost like, well, what's right? And what programs work? And we talk about it with Katrina, our new youth minister, who just came on, and we're working with her. If there was a magic bullet, if there was a silver right thing to do, we would be doing it. So we really don't know what that is. And that's where the discernment part comes. Should we do a particular program, try a particular program? Absolutely. We have to figure out what it is that makes faith not so important in their lives. Some of it's this culture in which we live, and perhaps we have to challenge the culture, and I think we all do that in our own ways. Just putting together 4 priorities like this is a little different than the priorities you'll see on some other programs and activities, but it's a way of trying to change their viewpoint and let them know how much God loves them. Life Teen and Edge and the other programs we have here are one way of doing it, but I think we do need to explore more ways of doing it. And of course, it also gets to the family and a lot of parents who don't necessarily have it. They don't have faith. Thank God we do. But for them to see the connection, and we get so caught up in this country with so many different things that it's hard for them to see. But that's part of that discernment process. Is like, and ask them. The funny thing is when you sit down with youth and you ask them what they want, and it usually bears no resemblance to what we plan on giving them, but they're smarter than we give them credit for because they understand deeply. They hunger for something, even if they can't name it. And we have to figure out how to meet that hunger, how to feed that hunger.
I was just going to say that the relationships in a lot of school districts, they have they're asking for adults to tutor an individual student.
Mm-hmm.
So when you make a relationship
Sure.
with one child,
One at a time.
be that person in their life that really shows them that somebody cares about them.
And that's,
Almost all school districts have that now.
oh, sure.
Because they recognize how important that is, and that a lot of kids don't have anybody to help them.
And what's interesting about what we just saw, and they mentioned it in the video, and it was mentioned again about Arrupe, is that even in a culture that seems to be totally devoid of faith, and it's not totally devoid, but there's a lot of unbelief in our world today. What's remarkable is that there's 1 million people around the country, thousands of people, that are doing amazing work, volunteerism. They're working on providing service. You get these people who are so committed, but if you mention the word faith to them, they say, no, 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 no. But maybe, just maybe, God is speaking through their interest in helping their fellow man. Maybe they don't even realize that God is acting through them. And maybe we have something to learn from them about being of service to our neighbor. They can show us a great deal because they're good people. They are really good people. You might never, ever see them in the church, but they're good people. There's a phenomenon going on, and I apologize because I have the 11 o'clock Mass, but there's a phenomenon going on in the Church of England right now, and I don't know if you're familiar with English church practices, but they have something called Evensong, and it's basically Sunday night prayer, sung every Sunday night. Not everyone has to go, it doesn't become an obligation, but people are invited back after going to services in the morning or the night before, and it's a very short, very simple service at 5 or 6 in the evening to celebrate the end of the Lord's Day. A phenomenon that's happened in the country of England is no one goes to church in the morning, but the entire church is full for Evensong. And it makes you wonder. I read an article that said, why? Well, sometimes people, they're not quite ready to take their place in that seat on Sunday morning. But going to Evensong is like peeking in the side door, that maybe, just maybe, there's something in there for them. And we have to be that invitation for those people. We have to let them see that we agree with them on those issues of justice. We have common interests. But issues of justice alone, and I refer to this in my homily at the 9 o'clock Mass, we can volunteer and volunteer and volunteer until we have no more energy. And are we ever going to solve all of the world's problems? No, we're not. No, we're not. That's the difference. Sometimes if you leave yourself there, you can become bitter. Well, what's the point? But as Christians, as people of faith, we have hope. We know that God will take care of them one way or the other, but that doesn't mean we don't do what we can now, even if it's one child at a time, even if it's one issue at a time. An awful lot within the society, I know. You know what believe it or not, the biggest hindrance to vocations in our world today is parents who talk their sons and daughters out of it. In the old days, it was quite the opposite, perhaps overboard, that parents forced their children into it, but now it's the other way. And of course, there's a lot of good reasons. Parents are fearful for their children. The church has gone through all kinds of trouble and tumult. I don't have to go into it for you to know what I'm talking about. But the idea, every parent wants their child to have a good life and make a good contribution. So I think we do need, as people of faith, to pray for vocations, that God is still planting the vocations, it's just that they're not being allowed to bloom. And we have to create an environment in which we allow them to bloom. tied to that, however, I think, is God is challenging us as baptized Christians to follow our baptismal call to take on roles of leadership within the church. And we got into this culture in the United States especially that we kind of had a professional clergy and a professional group of religious sisters, and we relied on them to do everything. And that's really not the way it's supposed to be. As baptized Christians, we all have a responsibility. It's differing degrees. We all have different areas of responsibility. And then, nurturing that call to ordained ministry or to religious life is an important one. And I think we'll see that, and that's changing. And you see sparks of that renewing, and you see, Pope Francis inspiring a new generation as Pope John Paul II inspired a generation. It might be quite different than what we're used to, and it still hasn't made itself quite visible, but hopefully it's something that we can see. Thank you. Well, unfortunately, I have to run over to the 11 o'clock Mass. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I hope you can join us on Thursday. If you check on the website, all the details are there, and that will just be the first of many. All these, you're going to be hearing about these preferences again and some of these opportunities again, so I think, well, might as well throw them out there and let you know what we're working on. Thank you so much. Have a good afternoon.